So, Rancé then moves on in his book on the holiness and sanctity to give examples of how we might, of what form our penitential life might be. What sort of penances are we dealing with here? How does that life, the whole monastic life, imitate the life of Christ, the great penitent? Well, it involves everything we do, every single deed, every single thought. But he starts off by, for example, talking about poverty, the poverty of the monastic life. And when Rancé talks about poverty, he has a chapter on it in the book on the holiness. He is not, of course, necessarily talking about poverty of wealth or riches. That's part of the course. He's talking about poverty of spirit. Poverty of spirit. Not associating our things, not associating ourselves with the things of this world, not coveting the things of this world. This goes back to what I was saying in an earlier conference, being in the world but not of it. Being, in a sense, in the monastery, surrounded by things and people, that's what monasteries are, but not being of them, because we're detached from them. Detachment. Detachment. Why? Because, as John of the Ladder says, we can't look up and down at the same time. So poverty of spirit leads once again to the abolition of self-love and self-will. This is becoming a constant refrain. Now, how do we do? What are the techniques for reducing self-love and self-will? One of the most important, and one for which Rancé was criticized severely, was he demands obedience. This occurs again and again. It occurs regularly in the Holiness and Duty of the Monastic Estate. It occurs regularly in his commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict, because there's no question that the Rule of St. Benedict requires obedience. It does. Rancé emphasized again and again in the conferences and his other works, his other books. He emphasized again and again the absolute necessity of absolute obedience. In the monastery, what does Benedict say? In the monastery, the abbot or the abbess stands in the place of Christ. A monk or a nun owes, therefore, obedience to the superior. Not just obedience, but absolute, total, unquestioning, unwavering obedience. And he emphasizes this, and he's criticized for it. Let's go back to Daniel Larocque, head of Madame de Montbazon fame. Not only does he criticize Rancé rightly for maintaining wrongly that Christ instituted the monastic state, he also attacks him for his demand of absolute total obedience, pointing out how dangerous it can be and how it can make the abbot into a straightforward, unmitigated, unchallenged dictator. And it can, of course. You get a bad abbot or an abbess who has no discernment, and the fact that they know that they cannot be challenged is an awesome responsibility. Rancé makes this clear, so that just as Christ was obedient to the Father, so too a monk or a nun should be totally obedient to the superior of the monastery, who stands in the place of Christ. Which means, of course, that the superior, or the abbot in this case, has absolute total control, but also absolute and total responsibility for what is done. When Rancé demands total obedience, he is not doing anything new. As I said before, there's nothing in Rancé which is totally new, though some of the interpretations are novel. Bernard himself demands total obedience to the abbot, and he required it And so do all the other Cistercian abbots. They leave it perfectly clear. Borden of Fall makes it clear. Obedience is essential. Because, you see, obedience, according to Rancé, obedience is one of the ways in which we can abolish or reduce or limit self-will, self-love. I want to do this. The abbot says, no, you have to do this. Therefore you do it, which in theory helps you to limit or to reduce self-love. Now, inside yourself, it may in fact cause exactly the contrary of this, where you say to yourself, you may tell me to do this and I'll do it, but by God, I hope you go and fry in hell because of it, and I know that I'm right, even though I'm doing on the surface what you tell me. I don't believe you're right, but I will do it anyway. Blah, 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 humbug, boo, blah, blah. And no doubt this happens. I remember on many occasions when I was a teenager, my parents telling me what to do, and those days long ago, that was in about 1800, when I was young, boys, teenage boys, young teenage boys, more or less did what their parents told them to do, which is not the case nowadays. I did it, but I can't say I did it willingly. And my own self-righteous pride was merely aggravated by being told what to do when I'd certainly done something wrong. There's no question about that. And I was rebuked for it and told to do something else by my father, which I did, but it did not reduce my self-will. It made me even more self-will than I was before. So there's always a danger in that. And of course the abbot there are certain limits to what the abbot can tell you to do. In theory, the abbot is limited by Actually, he's limited by the rule of St. Benedict, but more especially by the strictures, the injunctions given by Jesus of Nazareth himself, who was the epitome of obedience in the gospel, in the scriptures. But if, in fact, are there times when a monk, or nun, of course, I'm talking about monks because he's talking to monks, are there times when the monk can actually refuse the abbot? Yes, there are. Listen to what Rancé himself says. Even the superiors can, in some cases, give you a dispensation from some points of your rule, i.e. the rule of St. Benedict, where real necessity or other important considerations demand it. Nevertheless, if they should suggest to you that the rule be annulled or weakened, you should give no heed to their advice, nor obey their commands. In such a case, you should not conform to their will without turning your back on the will of God. In other words, there are times when a monk can justly refuse to do what they're told to do by an abbot because it is contrary to the rule of St. Benedict, which, for Rancé, has to be observed not to the whole letter, but to the whole spirit, of which more later. So yes, there are limits to it, but there is no doubt that the requirement for absolute obedience puts a huge responsibility on the abbot and demands that an abbot have a very, very great grace of discernment. They really do. Rancé, I think there are errors here and there, but on the whole, he obviously had that charisma, that discernment, which enabled him to see into the heart of people and tell them where they were going wrong, why they were going wrong, and how it might be corrected. He had that. But if he didn't have that, and we have plenty of examples of absolutely tyrannical abbots. We've got plenty of examples of it. Sometimes because they were just not particularly bright, not particularly intelligent, they couldn't see what needed to be done, and sometimes because they were really rather nasty people. This was not, however, I think, the case with Rancé, who, as I say, whose monks really did love him. Love is essential here. And he says, you know, what is the essence? The essence of monastic life is, of course, following Christ, who is a great penitent. But what does Christ teach? He teaches God. And who is God? What is God? God is love. And he is perfectly well aware that, as Christ says when he's asked about it, what are the two great commandments? One is love God, and the other one is love your neighbour. And he, in his book on the holiness and duties of monastic life, he then moves on to discuss the question of fraternal charity, the love that monks can have for each other. And we have to be careful with words here. English is not very good with words for love. We have, I love, for example, I love a glass of good wine, and I love my cat, and when my mother was alive, I could say I love my mother. But if we're using the same love, the word love, in exactly the same way in all three cases, then we're in some trouble. Greek is better, but English is a little bit limited in its words. But when we use the term charity, caritas, we don't mean in this case giving things to the poor, giving money to the poor. We mean the highest degree of love. When Rancé talks about charité, charity, he means the perfectest form of love that we can achieve, that form of love which is not physical, which is not designed, which is not synonymous with lust, but which is designed to, which is aimed not for your own comfort, but for the comfort and improvement of the person whom you are loving. So fraternal charity is not just any sort of love, but the highest form of love between the brothers, or in the women of les clercs, between the sisters. And he spends some time on this. He in this is in a sense following the footsteps of Baldwin of Ford, whom we met a number of times here, because Baldwin, in a wonderful passage, says God doesn't need anything. God is omnipotent. God is infinite. God has everything. The world is his. He made it. He created it. He does not need anything. Therefore, he does not need our love. Doesn't need it. Therefore, he has put in his place our neighbour, that by loving our neighbour, we are loving him. So our neighbour is someone who has been put by God in his place, so that instead of loving God, who doesn't need our love, we can love a neighbour who most certainly does need it. And that's why, again, once again, the cenobitic life, the communal life, is so important to Rancé as it was to Baldwin of Ford, whom I can't remember whether I mentioned it before. Yes, I did. When we have Baldwin used the analogy of rusty pieces of metal which are jangling together in a bag, being rustled together, rushed together, and as they get banged together, the little bits of rust fall off and they become cleansed. Same with Rancé. Fraternal charity is the love that we have, the pure love that we have for our brethren. But we have to be careful here. He has no time for particular friendships. There's always a danger in the monastery. We're not talking about homosexuality or physical love in any way whatsoever here. We are talking about charity, the highest and most perfect form of love. And he explains how it might be done. He suggests, for example, how can you love him? How can you love your brother? How can you love your brothers? By showing each other all those marks of gentleness, affection, and deference that the monastic rule can permit. In other words, the rule is your guide. Within the rule, you may show the deference, you may show the gentleness, you may show all the affection, but only within the limits of the rule. It's like this table. We can shift things around on this table, but we don't go beyond the edges. And he says, one of the ways in which you can do it is by praying for your brethren, praying for your sisters, because as we know from the last conference or two of them, prayer is absolutely essential. He says the necessity and the usefulness of prayer means that we pray for each other. It is through prayer that we obtain from God whatever grace we need to persevere in his service. Prayer is really, really important. Listen to what Rancé says. Don't be afraid that by asking for things for your brothers in prayer, you're giving up what you need for yourselves, and that God will reduce what he gives to you in accordance with what you, through your prayers, have gained for them. In other words, don't feel that grace is limited. that if you ask for God to give grace to your brothers for this and that, he will withhold it from you. Grace is like the sun. It just pours forth its light on good and bad alike. Because if this is not the case, I'm in deep doo-doo. No, it's there all the time. So don't be afraid of this. Ask for your brothers. Ask for your brothers. Never think that the time you spend with God on their behalf is taken away from you. On the contrary, you should know that your own affairs never succeed better with God than when you commend to him those of your brothers and sisters. By doing that, that's how, in fact, you're praying for yourself. So in other words, you want to know how to pray for yourself? Answer, pray for others. That's how it works. And that is the most effective way. Why? Because you love your neighbour as yourself. In fact, ideally, you're going to love your neighbour more than yourself. And beyond that, you love God, who has set your neighbour in his place for you to love him or her. Charity, he says, is the bond and foundation of monastic communities. And by charity, we're talking about the highest form of love. So where do we move on to from there? I will tell you. We talked about penance and the penitential life. We've talked about poverty of spirit. We've talked about prayer. We've talked about fraternal love. And then Rancé goes on to deal with certain other matters which are also part and parcel of the penitential life. And there are 4 of them. One is humiliations, which we talked about before. 2, meditation on death. 3, meditation on the judgment of God. And 4, the technical term compunction. All these, says Rancé, are interior penance, because he says penance and penitence is both external and internal, both exterior and interior. All that we've talked about so far is interior penance, poverty of spirit, fraternal charity, the importance of prayer, prayer for others above all, prayer for others, the love of God. All these are internal, and the same with humiliations, which, as I said, he does not invent. He borrows from both John of the Ladder and then from Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, in his letter 87, letter 87 says, if you want the virtue of humility, you must not avoid humiliations. So Rancé just takes this up and runs with it, And I won't say any more about that, because we already said all that we need to say about that with the great controversy with Guillaume Le Roy, in which Rancé does not appear at his best. There's no doubt about that. And the business of humiliations is yet another thing criticised by Daniel de la Roque, with some justice. And we know, although certainly it was used in the earlier part, I don't know how recent it has been used in the modern Cistercian tradition, but I can certainly remember an old monk in Weimar telling me how when he joined the order, he was in his 80s at the time, humiliation was still practiced, but you would know better than I how much it is still, whether at all it's still used today. I don't think it is, but certainly not in the same way that Rancé would have used it. He was certainly criticised for it, and quite seriously, by the world outside the gates. Inevitably, he has to defend himself at this. He defends himself very well. Humiliation, he says, the way to humility, quoting again St. Bernard, and then he defends himself by quoting the sources. He quotes Ambrose, he quotes Augustine, he quotes Basil, he quotes St. Benedict, he quotes St. Gregory the Great, and he even quotes Teresa of Avila on this matter. As usual, trying to bolster himself by record by the list of authorities. This was standard at the time. This was what all the 17th century writers did. You had to have your auctoritates, your authorities. You said what you had to say, and then he said, yes, but what I'm saying is supported by all these writers. And then he quotes them at length, So again, we won't go on, we don't need to go on about that. But humiliations, in fact, the living a life of being humbled is, he says, a continual crucifixion. And in this too, as a continual crucifixion, we are imitating our Lord and Master, who himself, of course, was crucified for our sake. And what is the end of crucifixion? Death. And this again leads to something we already said before. Yes, there was high mortality at La Trappe, but the business of the monk was not to live. The business of the monk was to die for Christ. And so we have meditations on death and meditation on the judgment of God. And this all fits in with the Augustinian penitential spirituality of the 17th century. Where do we stand at the moment? We stand as depraved human beings who cannot do a good thing to merit grace. We can only rely on the grace of God, and if that grace does not come, then we will be doomed. We are doomed. So let us meditate on death and make sure that what we can do, all that we can do. It's up to God in the end. It's up to God in the end. Let us do all that we can do to make sure that our death is a good one, and meditate on the last judgments as to what might happen if in fact we get caught on the wrong side. And this was not again uncommon at the time. We have lots and lots, we have a lot of writers at the time who give these long descriptions of what the day of judgment will be like, hellfire sermons. I heard them here in St. John's, not so much. Actually, even about just a few years ago, I still heard a Roman Catholic priest here in St. John's give a true 18th century hellfire sermon with fire and brimstone, flesh being burned off and everything. I thought it was a wonderful sermon. It was totally complete nonsense, but it was very dramatic indeed. I could almost feel the heat. My God, was he ever good. Rubbish, if I may say so, but he was very good at preaching his rubbish. It was a magnificent sermon, but totally out of about 1780. He was a very old priest, I might add, and has now gone to his reward, where I do not know. But I remember that, I heard it even now today. But this was typical of the time, the judgments of God. And we teetering on the brink of hell. That's what we're going to get, unless God gives us his grace. And you know, this is the problem with the Augustinian tradition, the Augustinian idea of the total depravity of human beings. We can do all that we like, we can ask God all that we wish, and ultimately it's up to God as to whether in fact we get that grace or whether we don't. I'm not going to go here into the question of purgatory and all that, but that was the situation at the time, and the idea of human depravity was universal among Rancé's colleagues and contemporaries. And death, too, was not a private affair. It tends to be nowadays. Death was a public affair. Making a good death was a real drama. It involved the deathbed scene in which everybody, you're surrounded by your friends and acquaintances, or in the monastery by all the brothers or all the sisters, still the case in fact, and where the abbot was there holding the hand of the monk, and the liturgy was being said. The whole thing was a drama. And then the monk, the dead body being laid out in a certain way, and then the wake of the body and so on. And I want to make this as wide as possible, not just in the monastery, but outside the monastery too, with the funeral carriage, the funeral cortege. And one excellent writer wrote a book called Death and the Enlightenment, in which he spends a couple of chapters describing what it was to make a good death, This is what Rancé is talking about here. Again, the man of his times. And for us nowadays, it's sometimes hard to appreciate this. Although, if you go to a modern Irish Roman Catholic wake, you get an idea of what it was like and what it's like now. And there's a big similarity. There's a big similarity. It may not be much in favour today, but it was standard in in Rancé's France. And the exhortation to meditate on death and to meditate on the judgments of God is not just Rancé, but as this man, John McMasters, as his name has shown, it was universal in the 17th century France and in 18th century France at that time. And, says Rancé, I'll quote him again, in fact, meditating on death, what does it do? It expels sloth, it cures inconstancy of soul, it prevents the mind from wandering, it makes penance pleasurable. Suffer a little now to avoid suffering in eternity then. Makes penance pleasurable. It destroys the bitterness of humiliations. Humiliate yourself a little bit now so you will not be humiliated forever later. It kills intemperance. It disengages us from all earthly things. It makes our prayers more fervent. It inspires pious thoughts, and it preserves devotion. And, as I said, and that is not all, for as St. John of the Ladder says, quoting Rancé, all virtues are its mothers and daughters. In other words, meditation on death produces every virtue that you need, because you're so bloody frightened of what's going to happen to you that it forces you to do good whether you like it or not. This is a pessimistic age. It's not the age of optimism. Optimism comes in a little bit later with the Enlightenment. There's a change of state in the human mind then. A change of state, But this is not an age in which I would have liked to have lived, unless, of course, I was an extremely wealthy aristocrat with servants. The pessimism, the penitential spirituality, the penitential atmosphere of the time, not something that we can really fully appreciate, I think, nowadays. A different world, and this is the world of Rancé. Those, in essence, that in essence is the inner penance, the inward penitence, which Rancé is speaking about. In other words, as I say, I might quote him, weep for a few moments here to live in all eternity of joy. Wash your face unceasingly in the bitter waters of penitence. The time will come when you will soothe your sighs, dry your eyes, and change your sorrows into infinite consolation. We can see where he's coming from. We can understand him in his times. And that brings to an end the first volume of his book on the holiness and duties of the monastic life. The second volume turns to the actual practical exterior methods of penance and penitence, which I'll tell you about in the next conference.